A boy finds a baby in the trash and immediately takes it to the hospital. The doctor is horrified when he realizes that the cold October wind cut through the narrow streets of Ashbury, a small town in the north of England, with a biting sharpness that made Ethan James bury his face deeper into the collar of his coat. His backpack jostled with every hurried step as he walked down the familiar route toward school, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. The shortcut through the alley saved him a good 10 minutes on his journey, something he appreciated more now that the weather was getting colder. It was the kind of day where everyone wanted to stay inside. Ethan had taken this route dozens of times without incident. The alley was mostly deserted except for a few scattered trash bins and piles of leaves that had gathered in corners. He had never found it threatening. It was just a quick pass between two streets, a quiet little detour in an otherwise routine morning. Today, though, something felt different. As he approached the middle of the alley, the familiar sounds of the town, distant traffic, the occasional chatter of early morning commuters, faded, leaving an unsettling quiet in their place. It wasn't the silence itself that disturbed him, but something he couldn't quite name. A feeling. The kind that creeps up on you when something isn't right. Then he heard it. A sound so faint it barely registered at first. He stopped in his tracks and straining to listen. Was it the wind? No, it was something else. A weak, stuttering cry, like a small, desperate voice lost in the noise of the world. He looked around, confused, scanning the alley for the source. The cry came again, this time clearer. It was unmistakable now. A baby. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound sent a chill through his body, colder than the October air. He wasn't imagining it. Someone had left a baby out here, in the trash, in the cold. For a brief moment, his legs locked in place. His mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing, what he was supposed to do. His body told him to move on, but something else, a deep, gnawing fear, kept him rooted to the spot. He wasn't the type to get involved. His dad had always told him to keep his head down, mind his business, and stay out of trouble. The world was a complicated place, full of problems bigger than a 12-year-old could handle. And this was one of those problems. A newborn baby, abandoned and alone in a filthy alley. That wasn't something he knew how to deal with. His first instinct was to turn around, to pretend he hadn't heard anything, and walk away. Someone else would find the baby. Someone more equipped to handle this. Someone older, wiser, more responsible. Maybe a passerby. Maybe someone living nearby who heard the same cries he did. It wasn't his responsibility. What could he do anyway? But as soon as the thought entered his mind, guilt followed. What if no one else heard the cries? What if no one else was around? The baby's soft, desperate sounds seemed to grow louder in his mind, filling the alley. What if it was dying? Right there in front of him, and he just walked away. He glanced back toward the end of the alley, where the street opened up to the main road. If he kept walking, no one would know. He could go on with his day, get to school, and never think about it again. But then the image of that helpless baby flashed in his mind. Tiny, fragile, alone. If he didn't act, who would? Ethan's heart pounded harder as he realized he was at a crossroads. He could either ignore it and hope someone else would come, or he could push past his fear and do something. What if it was too late by the time someone else found the baby? He felt his stomach twist. He had to at least look. His legs trembled as he took a hesitant step toward the sound. Then another, inching closer to the pile of trash where the faint cries seemed to come from. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this nightmare behind, but his feet kept moving. The smell of rotting garbage hit him as he neared the trash bags piled against the alley wall. It was overwhelming, thick and putrid, and it made him want to gag. He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. His hands shook as he reached out to shift one of the bags aside, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. And then beneath the tattered remains of an old blanket, he saw it. A baby. A newborn. Tiny and pale. Swaddled in a filthy, torn piece of cloth. Its skin was so light it was almost blue, and its eyes were half closed, too weak to even cry properly. The little whimpers that had stopped Ethan in his tracks had faded into nothing more than shallow breaths. The baby wasn't moving much, its body limp and cold. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His entire body went numb as he stared down at the infant. For a few moments, everything else disappeared, the alley, the noise, even the cold air. There was just him and this fragile, abandoned life lying there in the trash. His mind blanked, overwhelmed by the horror of what he was seeing. This can't be real, he thought. Who would leave a baby here? His hands hovered above the baby, unsure of what to do. Should he pick it up? Should he call for help? His fingers shook as he crouched closer, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. This baby was going to die if he didn't do something. Right here, right now. But fear gripped him. What if he hurt the baby by moving it? What if it was already too late? 1,000 panicked thoughts raced through his head, each one more terrifying than the last. He wasn't equipped for this. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't know how to handle a newborn. But leaving it there, cold and alone in a pile of trash, felt even worse. If I don't act now, no one will, he thought again. This time with a sense of finality that settled deep in his chest. His movements became automatic, driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand. Carefully, he reached down and lifted the baby from the ground. The infant barely stirred, its tiny body almost weightless in his arms. It was cold, so cold it made Ethan's skin crawl with fear. He wrapped the blanket tighter around the baby, hoping to shield it from the biting wind. Ethan stood, the baby cradled against his chest, and started walking, slowly at first, then faster as adrenaline took over. The hospital was only a few blocks away, and he knew he had to get there fast. His legs felt like lead-eye, but his heart raced with urgency. He didn't know if the baby would make it, but he had to try. As he ran down the street, his mind whirled with questions he couldn't answer. What would the doctors say when he showed up with a baby he found in the trash? Would they think he was lying? Would they even be able to save it? But none of that mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was getting the baby to safety. The automatic doors of Ashbury General Hospital whooshed open as Ethan burst inside, the cold morning air clinging to his clothes as he stumbled into the warmth. His chest burned from the cold air he had inhaled during his frantic run, and his legs felt like jelly. Still, he clutched the tiny, limp form in his arms, feeling its frail weight and the soft, shallow breaths against his chest. A whirlwind of panic, fear, and something else, something urgent and raw, surged inside him. For a split second, the sight of the hospital lobby was overwhelming. It was brighter than he expected, the white fluorescent lights reflecting off shiny floors and sterile walls. People moved around him, patients, nurses, hospital staff, but none of them seemed to notice him at first. Not until he shouted, "Help! Please!" His voice cracked, catching the attention of a nurse at the reception desk. "It's a baby. I found a baby." The nurse's head snapped up, her expression shifting from casual distraction to alarm. Her wide eyes locked onto the bundle in Ethan's arm, and she was out of her chair in an instant, moving quickly toward him. The seconds that passed felt endless, and Ethan's grip on the baby tightened instinctively as the nurse reached him. Her hand hovered over the baby, her face filled with a mix of concern and disbelief. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she took in the sight of the newborn, wrapped in the filthy, torn blanket. "What happened? Where did you find it?" Ethan's throat was dry, his mouth moving but no words coming out. All he could do was gesture helplessly toward the door, the image of the alley still fresh in his mind. He wanted to explain, to tell her everything, but the sight of the baby lying there in the trash, so fragile and cold, had scrambled his thoughts. "Come with me," the nurse said urgently, snapping into action. She signaled to another nurse at the far end of the room, who rushed over with a gurney. "We need to get this baby to the ER right away." In a blur, the second nurse appeared, her face stern with focus. The gurney was wheeled closer, and before Ethan knew it, the baby was lifted from his arms. For a brief moment, he hesitated, his hand still reaching out for the small form as it was placed on the gurney. The nurses worked with practiced precision, already checking the baby's pulse and breathing, shouting medical terms Ethan didn't understand. It was like watching a scene from a movie unfold before him, unreal and terrifying. He couldn't move, rooted to the spot as the nurses rushed the baby down a hallway and through a set of swinging doors, disappearing from view. The small cries that had pierced the quiet of the alley had faded into eerie silence, leaving Ethan standing there, his heart pounding so loudly in his chest that it echoed in his ears. Someone touched his arm, pulling him from the daze. It was the first nurse, her voice softer now, though still urgent. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face. "Are you hurt?" Ethan shook his head, the words finally forming. "No, I found the baby in an alley, behind the shops." The nurse's eyes widened and her face paled slightly. She knelt down to his level, her voice careful and calm. "You found the baby just now?" How long has it been out there? I don't know, Ethan replied, his voice trembling. It was just there, lying in the trash. I heard it crying and... He swallowed hard, trying to push back the knot that was rising in his throat. I didn't know what to do. You did the right thing by bringing the baby here, she said, squeezing his arm gently. That was very brave. We'll take care of everything now, all right? Brave. That word echoed in his mind, though it felt hollow. Was it brave, what he had done? Or was it just what anyone would have done? The thought of leaving the baby there, of turning away and pretending he hadn't heard anything, had crossed his mind for just a split second back in that alley. And that thought made him feel ashamed now, even if he had pushed it aside and acted. But he had acted. He was here. And now it was out of his hands. The nurse guided him to a nearby bench, sitting him down carefully as if he were the one who needed medical attention. I'll get you some water, okay? Just sit tight. You've had a big shock. Ethan nodded, though his body felt numb, his mind still racing through the events of the last half hour. It had all happened so fast, but now, in the sterile calm of the hospital, the weight of it hit him. His hands were trembling slightly, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving him shaky and cold. He could still feel the baby's frail weight in his arms, the tiny body so still and cold that it made his chest tighten with fear. Is the baby going to be okay? The question lingered in his mind, heavy and unanswerable. The nurse returned with a small plastic cup of water, pressing it into his hand with a reassuring smile. Here, drink this. You're going to be all right. Ethan took a sip, though the water did little to soothe the dryness in his throat. He glanced toward the swinging doors where the baby had disappeared, his heart still thudding painfully in his chest. What's going to happen to the baby? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The nurse sighed softly, her expression shifting to something more somber. The doctors are working on stabilizing the baby now. It was in a bad state when you brought it in, but you got here just in time. That might have saved its life. Ethan stared at her, the enormity of what she was saying sinking in. He had saved a life. That thought alone felt surreal, like something that happened in movies or stories, not in real life, not to him. But it didn't feel like a victory. The image of the baby's pale, weak body kept flashing in his mind, and all he could think about was how fragile it had been. How close to death. Just in time, he repeated, the words hollow on his lips. The nurse gave him a sympathetic look, patting his shoulder lightly. The doctors will do everything they can, okay? You've done more than enough. The baby's safe now. But Ethan wasn't sure that was true. The baby might be in the hands of doctors, but safe felt like a word that didn't belong here. Not when the baby had been abandoned in the trash, left to die. And what would happen next? What if the baby didn't make it? What if? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. A man in a white coat, his hair graying at the temples and his face etched with lines of exhaustion, stopped in front of him. His hospital ID badge read, Dr. Harper, and he gave Ethan a small, tired smile. Hi there, Dr. Harper said, his voice calm but firm. I'm Dr. Harper. You're the one who brought the baby in, right? Ethan nodded, gripping the cup of water tightly in his hands. First off, I want to tell you that what you did was incredible, Dr. Harper continued, kneeling down slightly to meet Ethan's gaze. You acted quickly, and that might have saved the baby's life. You should be very proud of yourself. Proud. Another word that felt out of place, heavy with responsibility. Ethan didn't feel proud. He felt scared, worried, unsure of what was going to happen next. But he nodded again, his throat too tight to speak. The baby's in critical condition right now, Dr. Harper went on, his tone more serious. It was severely malnourished and dehydrated when you brought it in. We're doing everything we can to stabilize it, but it's going to take some time. Right now, we're monitoring its breathing and giving it fluids. Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped for a clearer answer, something more certain. Is it going to be okay? Dr. Harper sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. We're hopeful, but it's too early to say for sure. The baby's condition is very fragile, and it was exposed to the cold for a long time. We're doing everything we can, but right now we just have to wait and see. The pit in Ethan's stomach deepened. Wait and see. It sounded like a long, endless stretch of uncertainty, the kind that gnawed at you from the inside. What happens now? Ethan asked, his voice small, almost afraid of the answer. Well, Dr. Harper said, standing up and folding his arms across his chest. "After we stabilize the baby, we'll have to notify the authorities. There'll be an investigation. We need to find out who left the baby there and why. It's important that we get to the bottom of this so that the baby can be placed in a safe environment." "The authorities," Ethan repeated, feeling a jolt of unease. Dr. Harper nodded. "Yes, the police will need to be involved. In cases like this, when a baby is abandoned, it's considered a criminal matter. But more than that, we need to understand what led to this. Sometimes people abandon children out of desperation, or because they feel they have no other choice. It's tragic, but it happens." Ethan looked down at his hands, his mind whirling with thoughts he couldn't untangle. The idea of police getting involved made everything feel heavier, more real. He had found the baby, but now it would become a case, an investigation. People would be asking questions that might not have easy answers. "What happens to the baby after?" he asked quietly. If it gets better." Dr. Harper hesitated for a moment, his eyes softening. "If the baby pulls through, it will likely be placed into the care of social services. From there, they'll assess the situation and determine whether the baby can be placed with a family or if it will need to go into foster care. But that's a long process. Right now, we're just focused on making sure the baby survives." Ethan swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. The thought of the baby being passed from one system to another, without a family, without anyone to care for it, made his chest ache. It wasn't fair. No baby should have to go through that, especially not one that had already been abandoned once. He wanted to ask more, but the words stuck in his throat. What about the baby's mother? What would happen to her, and why had she left her child like that? Ethan couldn't shake the image of the baby in the trash, discarded like it didn't matter. But the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if there was more to the story. If the mother had been scared, or desperate, or alone. "We'll let you know if there are any updates, Wang," Dr. Harper said, giving him another reassuring smile before turning to leave. "For now, try to rest. You've done a lot today." As the doctor walked away, Ethan felt the weight of the situation settle more heavily on his shoulders. He had done everything he could, but somehow, it didn't feel like enough. The baby was still fighting for its life, and there were so many unknowns, so many things that could still go wrong. He leaned back in the chair, his head resting against the wall as he stared up at the ceiling. His mind was buzzing with too many thoughts to sort through, each one more confusing than the last. All he knew was that he couldn't just walk away now. He couldn't just forget what had happened, couldn't go back to his normal life and pretend that this morning hadn't changed everything. The baby's fate wasn't in his hands anymore, but that didn't stop him from caring. It didn't stop the feeling deep inside him that he had to see this through, whatever that meant. Even if it meant waiting in this hospital for hours, days, however long it took. He wasn't ready to let go, not yet. The fluorescent lights of Ashbury General Hospital flickered slightly as Ethan sat in the small waiting room, his legs bouncing nervously. The thin plastic chair felt too small, too stiff beneath him, but he hadn't moved since Dr. Harper had given him the initial update. He kept his eyes fixed on the double doors leading to the emergency room, hoping with every fiber of his being that the next person to come out would have good news. The minutes felt like hours, and the air was heavy with the kind of silence that made everything worse. Nurses passed by in quick motions, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet hallway, but none of them spared a glance at the boy sitting so still, lost in thought. Ethan couldn't stop replaying the moment he had found the baby in his mind. The faint, heartbreaking cry cutting through the alley, the pile of garbage, the tiny form wrapped in a filthy, torn blanket. His stomach twisted at the thought. The baby had been so small, so fragile, and yet whoever had left it there hadn't thought twice. Who could do something like that? He wondered for what felt like the 100th time. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image from his mind. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there when a figure finally appeared in his peripheral vision. His heart leapt, hoping it was someone coming to tell him that the baby was okay, but it was just Dr. Harper again. The man looked more tired than the last time Ethan had seen him. Dark circles under his eyes and a weary expression etched onto his face. He approached Ethan slowly, his steps cautious as if he were preparing for a difficult conversation. "Ethan," Dr. Harper said softly, his voice a little hoarse. "We need to talk for a moment." Ethan's heart sank. The tone in the doctor's voice wasn't one that carried good news. He had heard that tone before, when the doctor had explained that his mother wasn't coming home from the hospital after her long illness. That same sense of dread crawled up his spine now, settling in his chest. Without saying a word, Ethan stood up, his legs shaking slightly as he followed Dr. Harper down the hall. The doctor led him to a small consultation room, a sterile, impersonal space with pale blue walls and uncomfortable chairs. There was a large window that overlooked the hospital parking lot, the view showing nothing but rows of cars and a gray, overcast sky. The room was eerily quiet except for the faint hum of machinery in the distance. Ethan sat down stiffly, barely aware of his movements, his mind spinning with the possibilities of what Dr. Harper was about to say. The doctor took a seat across from him, exhaling slowly before beginning. "The baby is stable for now," he started, his eyes flicking over to Ethan as if gauging his reaction. "But the situation is still very serious. The infant was severely malnourished and dehydrated when you brought it in. It's going to take time for the baby's body to recover from that kind of neglect." Ethan swallowed hard, the knot in his throat making it difficult to speak. "So, the baby's going to be okay?" Dr. Harper paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "We're hopeful," he said carefully, his voice tinged with caution. "But it's still too early to tell for sure. The baby's condition was critical when you found it, and there are still complications we're keeping an eye on." "What kind of complications?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor leaned forward, his tone growing more serious. "There are signs of physical trauma," he explained. "The baby has bruising on its arms and legs, and there's an older fracture, probably a broken rib that was never treated. These injuries suggest that the baby wasn't just neglected, but possibly harmed in other ways before it was abandoned." Ethan's blood ran cold at the words. The thought of someone intentionally hurting a baby made his stomach turn, a deep, sickening anger bubbling up inside him. How could anyone do that to something so helpless, so innocent? His fists clenched on his lap, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to process the information. He had thought finding the baby in the trash was bad enough, but now, knowing that the infant had been hurt beforehand, it was almost too much to bear. Dr. Harper must have seen the emotion on Ethan's face, because he softened his tone, leaning forward slightly. "Ethan, I know this is a lot to take in," he said gently, "but I want you to know that you did everything right. You saved that baby's life by getting it here when you did. Without your quick thinking, the baby wouldn't have survived." Ethan nodded slowly, though the words barely registered. All he could think about was the baby's bruised body, the tiny ribs that had been broken and left untreated. The guilt washed over him in waves. He had found the baby, yes, but that didn't change the fact that someone had left it there to die. The idea that there was a person out there, someone who had hurt the baby and then abandoned it without a second thought, made Ethan feel sick. "What happens now?" he asked after a long moment, his voice small and uncertain. "What happens to the baby?" Dr. Harper leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest as he considered his response. "Well, the first priority is getting the baby healthy again. That could take a few days or even weeks, depending on how it responds to treatment. But once the baby is stable, social services will take over. They'll investigate the circumstances of the abandonment, and they'll be working with the police to try and find out who left the baby in the alley." "The police?" Ethan repeated, feeling a sudden jolt of nerves. "They're going to arrest someone." Dr. Harper hesitated, his expression growing more thoughtful. "That depends on what they find. If they can locate the mother or whoever was responsible for the baby's care, there will definitely be legal consequences. But it's not always as simple as arresting someone. Sometimes people do terrible things out of desperation. We don't know what the circumstances are yet." Ethan's stomach twisted again. Desperation, that word stuck with him. He had been thinking all along that whoever left the baby in the trash must have been cruel, heartless. But now, hearing Dr. Harper talk about it, he wondered if there was more to the story. Could someone have abandoned their child out of fear or desperation? Was it possible that they had been pushed to the edge, unable to care for the baby and not knowing where to turn? It didn't make sense to him, even if they had been desperate. How could anyone justify leaving a baby to die like that? But as much as he wanted to be angry, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was more to it. Maybe whoever had done this was just as lost and scared as the baby had been. What if they don't find the mother? Ethan asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. If they don't find the mother, or if she's deemed unfit to care for the child, then the baby will go into the foster care system, Dr. Harper explained. Eventually, if the baby's biological family can't be located or if they aren't suitable guardians, the child could be put up for adoption. Adoption. The word hung in the air like a promise and a threat all at once. Ethan had known kids at school who were adopted, and for some of them it had worked out okay. They had families who loved them, who gave them homes, but for others it hadn't gone so well. He thought of his friend Jake, whose foster parents had been cold and distant, more interested in the government checks than in Jake himself. Ethan's mind raced with questions he didn't know how to ask. What would happen to the baby after this? Would it be bounced around from home to home, never really finding a place where it belonged, or would it end up with a family who actually cared? The uncertainty of it all made his chest ache. Will I ever see the baby again? Ethan asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Dr. Harper seemed surprised by the question. That depends on what happens next, he said carefully. Once social services takes over, they'll be in charge of the baby's welfare. It's possible that you could stay updated on the baby's condition, but once the legal process starts, it's largely out of our hands. Ethan nodded slowly, though his heart sank at the thought. He had found the baby, brought it to the hospital, but now it felt like everything was slipping away. It felt wrong somehow to just walk away from it all now. He had been there at the start. Didn't that mean something? Didn't that give him some sort of responsibility? But he wasn't family. He wasn't an adult. And he wasn't a part of the legal system that was now taking over. The feeling of helplessness gnawed at him, tightening in his chest. Before Ethan could ask anything else, there was a knock on the door. A tall man with dark hair and a serious expression stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. He wore a dark suit and a badge clipped to his belt. Ethan immediately knew this was the detective Dr. Harper had mentioned earlier. "Ethan, I'm Detective Harper," the man said, his voice calm but firm. He held a notepad in one hand, flipping it open as he sat down across from the boy. "I need to ask you a few questions about what happened today. It won't take long, but we need as much information as possible." Ethan nodded, his heart racing again. He had known this was coming. The police had to be involved, but now that it was happening, it felt more real. His hands fidgeted in his lap, and he struggled to keep his breathing steady. The detective gave him a reassuring look. "You're not in trouble, Ethan. You did a really good thing today, but we need to understand what happened so we can help the baby and figure out who's responsible." Ethan nodded again, though his throat felt tight. "Let's start from the beginning," Detective Harper said, his pen poised over the notepad. "Tell me everything you remember. How did you find the baby?" Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing back to that moment in the alley. He described everything as best he could. The shortcut he always took to school, the strange silence that had made him stop, the faint cry that had led him to the trash pile. He told the detective how he had been too scared at first to check, how he had hesitated, unsure if he even wanted to see what was making that sound. But then when he couldn't ignore it anymore, he had uncovered the baby, lying there so still and cold. As he spoke, he could feel the tension in the room building, the weight of what he had witnessed hanging over him like a shadow. The detective listened carefully, jotting down notes but not interrupting. When Ethan finished, he sat back, his hands still shaking slightly. "Did you see anyone near the alley when you found the baby?" Detective Harper asked, his tone more intense now. "Any cars or people who might have been acting suspiciously?" Ethan shook his head. "No, it was really quiet. I didn't see anyone." The detective's expression didn't change, but he scribbled something in his notebook before closing it. "All right, thank you, Ethan. That helps a lot. We'll be investigating the area, checking for security cameras or any witnesses who might have seen something." Ethan swallowed hard. The thought of someone out there, someone who had left the baby to die, made his skin crawl. And now, knowing that the baby had been hurt before it was abandoned, it was all too much. He wanted to ask what would happen next, if they would catch the person responsible, but the words stuck in his throat. Detective Harper stood up, giving Ethan a small nod before heading for the door. "You've done everything you can," he said as he left. "We'll take it from here." And then, just like that, he was gone, leaving Ethan alone with Dr. Harper once more. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan sat there, staring at the floor, his mind spinning with everything he had just heard. The baby was stable, but still at risk. The police were looking for the mother, or whoever had left the child in the alley, and somewhere in all of this, Ethan felt like he was losing his grip on everything. He had found the baby. He had been the one to bring it to the hospital, but now it felt like things were slipping away from him, like his role in this was over, even though it didn't feel like it should be. Dr. Harper stood up slowly, his face softening as he looked at Ethan. "I know this is a lot to process," he said gently. "If you need to talk to anyone, we have counselors here who can help. You've been through a very traumatic experience today, and it's okay to feel overwhelmed." Ethan shook his head. "I'm fine," he mumbled, though he wasn't sure if that was true. He didn't know what he felt. His chest ached, and his mind was a whirl of thoughts and questions that he couldn't sort through. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away now. Not yet. Not when everything felt so unfinished. Dr. Harper gave him a long, thoughtful look before finally speaking again. "If you ever want an update on the baby's condition, you can call the hospital. We'll keep you informed as much as we can, all right?" Ethan nodded, though his heart sank. He wanted to do more than just get updates. He wanted to be there to see the baby get better, to know for sure that it was safe. But he knew that wasn't possible. He wasn't family. He was just the kid who had found the baby, that's all. As Dr. Harper left the room, Ethan sat there alone, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The world outside felt distant, detached from everything that had happened today. It was as if the rest of the world had kept spinning while his life had been thrown into chaos. He felt small, powerless, and more alone than ever. For the first time since finding the baby, Ethan let himself cry. Ethan stood outside the hospital, the cold air biting at his skin as he zipped up his coat and shoved his hands deep into his pockets. The weight of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours hung heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't slept, he hadn't been able to. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the baby's tiny body lying in the trash, so fragile, so helpless. The hospital staff had told him to go home, to rest, but how could he? It felt wrong to just walk away, to leave the baby in someone else's hands and pretend everything was normal. But after hours of waiting, of sitting in that sterile, suffocating room, he had no choice. They couldn't give him any more updates. The baby was still in critical condition, and all they could do now was wait. Social services had already been notified, and the investigation had started. Soon, the police would be involved. It was out of his hands now, even though it didn't feel like it should be. As he walked down the empty street, his breath visible in the chilly October air, Ethan's thoughts spiraled. What was going to happen to the baby? Would they find the mother? Would she be arrested? He couldn't shake the image of the bruises, the broken rib, things that had happened before the baby had been abandoned. The idea that someone had hurt the baby made his stomach churn with anger. But the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. Who would do something like that, and why? He had tried asking Dr. Harper more questions, but the doctor hadn't had many answers. Everything was still too uncertain, too early. The investigation would take time. And even then, Ethan wasn't sure if he would ever get the closure he needed. He wasn't family, he wasn't part of the system. He was just a kid who had found the baby, who had done the right thing, but was it enough? The following morning, Ethan woke up with the same uneasy feeling in his chest. He hadn't been able to stay asleep for long. His dreams filled with haunting images of the alley and the baby's cries. He got dressed quickly, his mind already set on going back to the hospital. He needed to know if there was any change. He couldn't just sit at home and do nothing. His dad, noticing his restlessness at breakfast, looked at him with concern. "You okay, Ethan?" he asked, setting down his coffee cup. "You barely ate last night, and now you're rushing off again." Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to explain the weight he was carrying. I need to check on something," he muttered, pushing his cereal around in the bowl. He hadn't told his dad everything yet. The words felt too heavy, too complicated. How could he explain the overwhelming need he felt to see this through? To know that the baby was going to be okay? "Something at school," his dad pressed, frowning slightly. "You've been distracted since yesterday." Ethan shook his head. "Not school, He stopped, swallowing hard. "There's this baby. I found it yesterday in the alley behind the shops. Someone left it there, Dad. It was really bad and I had to take it to the hospital." His dad's face paled, the casual concern shifting into something more serious. "A baby," he repeated, his voice low. "Ethan, why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how," Ethan admitted, his voice shaking. "It all happened so fast, and I don't know what's going to happen to it now. I just feel like I can't walk away." His dad leaned back in his chair, processing what Ethan had just told him. After a long pause, and he spoke again, his tone more gentle this time. "Ethan, that's a lot for anyone to go through, let alone you. But you did the right thing by getting that baby to the hospital. I'm proud of you." Ethan nodded, but the words didn't bring him the comfort he wanted. He appreciated his dad's support, but it wasn't enough to quiet the worry that gnawed at him. "I just want to check on the baby," he said quietly. "I need to know if it's okay." His dad sighed softly, standing up and placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I get it, kid. If you want, I can drive you to the hospital." Ethan looked up at his dad, surprised by the offer. "Really?" "Yeah," his dad said, offering a small smile. "Let's go. You've got a big heart, Ethan. I don't want you carrying this on your own." The drive to the hospital was quiet, the streets still damp from the early morning mist. Ethan stared out the window, his mind still racing with thoughts about the baby. His dad hadn't said much after their conversation at breakfast, but his presence was reassuring in a way. It made Ethan feel less alone, like someone else understood how important this was. When they arrived at the hospital, Ethan's heart raced as he walked through the familiar automatic doors. He half expected the same nurse from the day before to be there, but the front desk had a new face, a younger nurse who smiled politely as Ethan and his dad approached. "Hi," Ethan said nervously. I'm here to check on a baby. I brought it in yesterday." The nurse's expression softened as she glanced at the computer in front of her. "You mean the baby that was abandoned?" Ethan nodded, his chest tightening at the word abandoned. "Yeah, that one." The nurse typed something into the system before nodding. "The baby's stable for now. The doctors are still monitoring closely, but it's a positive sign that the condition hasn't worsened overnight." A wave of relief washed over Ethan. Stable. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was better than the uncertainty he had felt all night. "Can I see it?" The nurse hesitated, her smile faltering. "I'm afraid you can't visit the baby directly. It's still in the intensive care unit, and only medical staff and social services are allowed in at this stage. But I can get Dr. Harper to give you an update if you'd like." Ethan's heart sank a little, but he nodded. "Okay, that would be great. Thanks." As the nurse walked away to find the doctor, Ethan sat down in the waiting area with his dad, trying to calm the mix of emotions swirling inside him. The knowledge that the baby was stable brought some comfort, but it didn't solve the bigger questions weighing on his mind. What would happen next? Would the baby get better? Would they find the person responsible? And what about the baby's future? Where would it go? His dad, sensing his unease, gave him a gentle nudge. "You're doing good, Ethan. I know it's hard not to feel like you're in control, but you've done more than most people would." "I just don't know what's going to happen to the baby," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if it never gets adopted? What if it gets lost in the system?" His dad's face softened with understanding. "That's a tough question, and I wish I had an answer for you. But I do know that because of you, that baby has a chance, and that's something no one can take away." Before Ethan could respond, Dr. Harper appeared, walking toward them with a kind but tired smile. "Ethan R.," he greeted. "I heard you were here. I'm glad you came back." Ethan stood up quickly, anxious for an update. "Is the baby still okay?" Dr. Harper nodded. "Yes, the baby's stable, which is a good sign. We're still monitoring closely, but things are moving in the right direction. The baby's vitals have improved overnight, and we're working on getting it stronger with fluids and proper nutrition." Ethan's shoulders sagged with relief, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's great news." Dr. Harper's expression remained serious, though. "There's still a long road ahead. The baby's condition was critical when you brought it in, so we're taking it one step at a time. But you should be proud of what you did. You saved that child's life." Ethan nodded, but the doctor's praise, while appreciated, wasn't enough to ease the tension in his chest. There was still so much uncertainty, so much that could go wrong. And then there was the looming question that had been gnawing at him since the night before. What would happen to the baby next? As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Harper sighed softly before continuing. Social services is involved now. They'll be handling the baby's case from here on out. The police are still investigating, trying to track down whoever left the baby in the alley, but that could take time. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. What happens if they don't find the person who did it? What happens to the baby then? Dr. Harper exchanged a look with Ethan's dad before answering. If the biological family can't be found, or if they're deemed unfit, the baby will likely go into foster care. It's too soon to say what the long-term outcome will be, but the important thing is that the baby will be in a safe environment, whether that's through foster care or adoption. Ethan's heart sank at the word foster care. He knew what that could mean. A life of being bounced from home to home, never really belonging anywhere. He had seen it with his friend Jake, who had been in and out of foster homes for years before being adopted by a family that didn't really care about him. The thought of that happening to the baby made his chest ache. Is there anything I can do? Ethan asked, his voice barely audible. Dr. Harper gave him a sad smile. You've already done so much, Ethan. Right now, the best thing you can do is trust the system to take care of the baby. I know it's hard, but you've given that child a chance at life. That's no small thing. Ethan wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't enough, but he didn't have the words. Instead, he nodded quietly, trying to process everything the doctor had said. His dad placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. Come on, his dad said softly. Let's get you home. We can come back tomorrow if you want to check in again. Ethan hesitated, his eyes lingering on the hallway that led to the ICU. He wanted to stay, to be close to the baby, but he knew there was nothing more he could do right now. With a heavy heart, he followed his dad out of the hospital, the weight of everything pressing down on him as they walked to the car. The next few days were a blur of school, restless nights, and constant worry. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the baby, wondering if it was getting stronger, if the doctors had found any new complications. Every morning before school and every afternoon after, he and his dad would stop by the hospital for an update. Each time, the news was cautiously optimistic, stable, improving, but still critical. It wasn't the reassurance Ethan wanted, but it was enough to keep him going. On the fourth day, when Ethan and his dad arrived at the hospital, Dr. Harper had news that sent Ethan's heart racing. The baby's been moved out of intensive care, Dr. Harper said with a smile. We're not out of the woods yet, but this is a very positive step. Ethan felt a surge of relief. Can I see the baby now? Dr. Harper hesitated for a moment before nodding. I can arrange for a brief visit, but only for a few minutes. Social services has been very strict about limiting visitors, but given your role in saving the baby, I'll make an exception. Ethan's heart pounded as he followed Dr. Harper down the hallway. His dad waited in the lobby, understanding Ethan's need to do this alone. As they reached the nursery, Ethan's pulse quickened. He had imagined this moment for days, seeing the baby, knowing it was okay. But now that it was about to happen, a part of him was terrified. What if the baby didn't recognize him? What if it didn't matter that he had been the one to save it? Dr. Harper led Ethan to a small room, where the baby lay in a bassinet, wrapped in a clean, soft blanket. The sight of the baby, so much healthier than the last time Ethan had seen it, brought tears to his eyes. The baby's skin was no longer pale and fragile looking. It was still small, still vulnerable, but there was life in the way its tiny chest rose and fell steadily. Hey, Ethan whispered, stepping closer to the bassinet. He reached out, his hand hovering above the baby's tiny fingers, unsure if he should touch them. It's me. The baby stirred slightly, a soft coo escaping its lips, and Ethan's heart swelled. He didn't know how long he stood there, just watching. But in that moment, everything else, the investigation, the uncertainty, the fear, faded away. For the first time in days, Ethan felt hope. Ethan's visits to the hospital became less frequent after that. The baby continued to improve, and social services became more involved, slowly taking control of the situation. It was bittersweet for Ethan, knowing that the baby's future was now in the hands of a system he had no control over. But Dr. Harper had promised to keep him updated, and that gave him some comfort. Weeks passed, and soon the baby was discharged from the hospital, placed into the custody of social services. Ethan never got to know the baby's fate, whether it was adopted, placed in foster care, or reunited with family, but he carried the memory of those days with him, a reminder of the connection he had shared with the child. However brief, in the end, Ethan understood that saving the baby had changed him in ways he couldn't have imagined. It had made him realize the importance of compassion, of stepping up when no one else would. And while he didn't have all the answers, he knew one thing for certain: he had made a difference. And that was enough. The sun was setting over Ashbury, casting a golden light over the streets as Ethan walked home from school. It had been a month since the baby had left the hospital, and though life had slowly returned to normal, a part of him still felt unsettled. He often found his thoughts drifting back to the baby, wondering where it was now, whether it was in a foster home or with a new family. No one had given him any updates since the baby was discharged, and while Dr. Harper had done his best to keep him informed, it was clear that once social services took over, the process became a private matter. Ethan had come to terms with that as much as he could, but the uncertainty lingered. He had become attached to the baby in a way he hadn't expected, and the idea of not knowing what had happened felt like an open wound that hadn't quite healed. His dad had tried to reassure him, telling him that the baby was safe now, that he had done everything he could, but Ethan wasn't sure if that was enough. As he turned the corner onto his street, he saw a familiar figure sitting on the front steps of his house. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized Dr. Harper, still in his white coat, though it looked a little more rumpled than usual. The doctor stood as Ethan approached, a smile on his face that was both warm and tired. "Dr. Harper?" Ethan asked, surprised to see him outside of the hospital. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to give you some news," Dr. Harper said, stepping down from the porch. "I figured you deserved to hear it in person." Ethan's heart began to race, a mixture of hope and fear bubbling up inside him. "Is it about the baby?" Dr. Harper nodded. "Yes. I know it's been a long time since we last talked, and I wanted to give you an update. The investigation is still ongoing, but the baby's been placed with a foster family for now. It's a temporary placement, but the good news is that the baby's doing very well. The foster parents are loving and attentive, and social services is optimistic about finding a permanent home soon." A wave of relief washed over Ethan. The idea of the baby being in a loving home, even temporarily, eased some of the weight that had been pressing on him for weeks. That's great," Ethan said, his voice catching slightly. "I'm glad," Dr. Harper smiled gently. "I thought you'd like to know. You've been through a lot these past few weeks, and I know how much you've cared about the baby. You made a difference, Ethan, more than you realize." Ethan looked down at his feet, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. I just want to know that the baby's going to be okay. That it'll have a good life, you know." Dr. Harper nodded, his expression understanding. "I think it will. The baby has a real chance now, thanks to you. But I also wanted to tell you something else." Ethan looked up, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" "The foster family has asked if you'd like to stay involved," Dr. Harper said, his tone careful. "They know about what you did, and they're open to the idea of you visiting the baby if that's something you want." Ethan blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "I can visit, really?" Dr. Harper smiled. "Yes, really. It would be a way for you to stay connected, to be a part of the baby's life, even if it's just in small ways." For a moment, Ethan was too stunned to respond. He had thought that once the baby was placed with a family, his involvement would be over. He had prepared himself for that reality, even if it hurt. But now, hearing that he could still be a part of the baby's life, something inside him shifted, a sense of hope, of possibility, that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. "I'd love that," Ethan finally said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'd really love that." Dr. Harper nodded, his smile growing wider. "I thought you might. I'll give the foster family your information, and they can set up a time for you to visit. It might take a little while, but I'm sure it'll happen soon." Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the day he found the baby. "Thank you, Dr. Harper," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything." The doctor placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to thank me, Ethan. You're the one who saved that baby's life. I just did my job." As Dr. Harper turned to leave, Ethan stood on the porch watching him walk down the street. The weight that had been pressing on him for weeks had finally lifted, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't expected to find. The baby was safe, and though the future was still uncertain, Ethan knew that he had done everything he could. And now, he had the chance to be a part of the baby's life in a way he hadn't thought possible. The first visit came a few weeks later. Ethan had been anxious the entire day, his mind racing with thoughts about what it would be like to see the baby again. The foster family, the Whitmans, lived just outside of Ashbury in a small, cozy house with a big garden. When Ethan and his dad pulled up to the house, he could see a swing set in the yard, and the sight of it made his heart swell. This was a place where a child could be happy, where a child could grow up safe and loved. Mrs. Whitman, a kind woman in her 40s with warm brown eyes, greeted them at the door. She welcomed Ethan in with a smile, her presence calming his nerves. "We're so happy you're here, Ethan," she said, leading him into the living room. "The baby's just waking up from a nap. You'll get to see him in a minute." Him. Ethan felt a jolt of surprise at the pronoun. He hadn't known whether the baby was a boy or a girl, and hearing it now, it made everything feel more real. Him. The baby was a boy. Mrs. Whitman disappeared into the next room, and a few moments later she returned with the baby in her arms. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw the little boy, so much healthier and stronger than the last time he had seen him. The bruises were gone, replaced by rosy cheeks, and his small body was wrapped in a soft blue onesie. The baby's eyes, bright and curious, blinked up at Ethan as Mrs. Whitman placed him in a bouncy chair on the floor. "Here he is," Mrs. Whitman said softly. "His name is James, but you can call him Jaime if you'd like." Ethan knelt down next to the chair, his heart swelling with emotion as he looked at the baby. Jaime. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against Jaime's tiny hand. The baby cooed softly, his eyes following Ethan's movements with fascination. "Hi, Jaime," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me. I'm the one who found you." Jaime blinked up at him, his little fingers curling around Ethan's in a soft, gentle grip. It was such a small thing, but to Ethan it felt like the world. In the weeks and months that followed, Ethan visited Jaime often. The Whitmans welcomed him with open arms, allowing him to be a part of Jaime's life in a way that made him feel like he belonged. As Jaime grew stronger, Ethan found himself growing too, learning the importance of kindness, of compassion, of stepping up when no one else would. The future was still uncertain. Ethan knew that Jaime's situation could change at any time. Social services could find a permanent family, or the legal process could take a different turn. But for now, Jaime was safe, happy, and loved. And for Ethan, that was enough. As he stood in the Whitmans' garden one sunny afternoon, watching Jaime play on the grass, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. The journey that had started in an alley, with fear and uncertainty, had led him here, to a place where hope was possible, where love was stronger than the darkness that had once threatened to swallow Jaime's life. Ethan smiled, knowing that whatever happened next, he had made a difference. He had saved Jaime's life. And in doing so, he had found something precious, too, a sense of purpose, of connection that would stay with him forever. Because sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, life gives you a second chance, and Ethan had taken it.
A boy running late for class finds a baby locked inside a car. Without hesitation, he rushes the baby to the hospital. Upon arrival, the doctor breaks down in tears when she realizes that Brookfield stirred to life under a sky already blazing with summer heat. The small town seemed to embrace a lazy rhythm, but for Ethan, there was no time to lose. The 16-year-old sprinted down the uneven sidewalks, his backpack swinging wildly behind him as he dodged a trash can and narrowly avoided colliding with a newspaper stand. He was late again. Ethan's mind raced with excuses he could give his history teacher, Mr. Porter. None of them would work, and he knew it. The man was unforgiving when it came to tardiness, and 3 strikes meant an automatic week of detention. His lungs burned, his sneakers pounded the pavement, and beads of sweat rolled down his forehead as he muttered, "One more block. Just one more block." The world around him blurred. Familiar streets, storefronts, and faces turned into a background haze as Ethan focused solely on reaching school. But then, a faint noise cut through his concentration. It was muffled, weak, and out of place against the backdrop of a quiet morning. He stopped abruptly, his shoes skidding on the sidewalk. The sound came again. A cry. Ethan turned toward the nearly empty parking lot of a nearby supermarket. The noise was faint, but it grew louder as he approached an old, sun-beaten sedan parked alone under the relentless sun. He squinted through the glare and froze. Inside the car, on the back seat, was a baby. The child was strapped into a car seat, its tiny face bright red and shiny with sweat, its hands weakly pressed against the window, and its mouth opened and closed in shallow cries. Ethan's stomach churned. "Hey!" he shouted, scanning the lot. "Anyone here? This your car?" His voice echoed, but no one answered. He ran up to the sedan and tried the door handle. It didn't budge. The car was locked. "No, no, no," he muttered, circling the vehicle and trying each door. The baby's cries grew weaker, and Ethan's panic rose with every passing second. The heat emanating from the car was intense. Even standing near it felt unbearable. Ethan could only imagine what it was like inside. The baby's head lolled slightly to the side, and its small chest heaved with shallow breaths. A terrifying thought struck him. This kid might not have much time left. "Hold on, buddy," Ethan said under his breath, his voice shaking as he searched the ground. His eyes landed on a large rock near the curb. He grabbed it without a second thought. "Sorry about this," he whispered, raising the stone above his head. With a decisive swing, he smashed it against the rear window. The glass shattered with a loud crack, scattering shards across the seat and onto the ground. A wave of suffocating heat hit Ethan as he reached through the jagged opening to unlock the door. Pulling it open, he leaned in and carefully unbuckled the child from the car seat. The baby was hot to the touch, its body alarmingly limp. Ethan cradled the child against his chest, his pulse racing. "You're okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for the baby or himself. The child's small frame felt impossibly fragile in his arms, and the shallow rise and fall of its chest sent a fresh wave of fear through him. Ethan stepped back from the car, scanning the lot for help. There was no one in sight. The world seemed frozen, silent except for the baby's faint breaths and the pounding of Ethan's own heart. The town clinic was 3 blocks away, a distance that had never felt so daunting. Tightening his hold on the baby, Ethan broke into a run. Every step felt heavier than the last, the heat pressing down on him like a physical weight. His arms ached from holding the baby, but he didn't dare slow down. The child whimpered softly, its cries barely audible now. "Just hang on," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with desperation. The streets of Brookfield blurred past him. The flower shop, the diner, the newsstand he had almost collided with earlier. People turned their heads as he raced by, some calling out, but Ethan didn't stop. His focus was on the clinic, a beacon of hope at the end of the street. The sight of its white facade gave Ethan a surge of energy. He pushed his legs harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs. The clinic's glass doors came into view, but to Ethan, they felt a world away. He tightened his grip on the baby. "Almost there," he muttered, but doubt gnawed at him with every labored breath the child took. Ethan burst into the clinic, his sneakers skidding on the polished floor as the glass doors slammed shut behind him. His voice cracked with panic as he shouted, "Help! Someone help me!" The small waiting room, filled with patients quietly flipping through outdated magazines, turned toward him in startled unison. Behind the reception desk, a nurse froze, her hand midair as she reached for a clipboard. Her eyes widened at the sight of Ethan holding the baby, whose flushed face and limp body told a story no words could convey. Ethan stumbled toward the desk, his chest heaving. "I found this baby? Locked in a car. It's not breathing, right? Please," he gasped, his voice raw from running and panic. The nurse's professionalism kicked in like a reflex. "Get Dr. Reeves now," she barked to an aide, who sprinted toward the double doors leading to the emergency rooms. She rounded the desk and approached Ethan, her hands steady but her expression tense. "Give me the baby," she said softly, but firmly. Ethan hesitated for a split second. He had held onto the child so tightly, so protectively, that handing it over felt almost impossible. But as the nurse reached out, her calm authority reassured him. With trembling hands, he passed the baby into her arms. The nurse cradled the baby and hurried through the double doors, leaving Ethan standing in the middle of the waiting room. His knees felt weak, and he leaned against the counter, trying to catch his breath. Around him, murmurs began to ripple through the waiting room. What happened? An older woman whispered to a man beside her. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking, "Is the baby gonna be okay?" Ethan heard none of it. All he could hear was the echo of the baby's faint cries, or had they stopped altogether? He couldn't be sure. Minutes felt like hours as Ethan stood there, frozen in place. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, the only sound breaking the suffocating silence in his mind. His hands still tingled where they had cradled the baby, and he found himself staring at them, as if expecting them to tell him whether he had done enough. A gentle voice pulled him back to reality. "Are you okay, son?" Ethan looked up to see a kind-faced woman in scrubs. Her name tag read Margaret, and she carried the air of someone who had seen countless crises but never grew numb to them. I don't know," Ethan stammered. "I found the baby in a car. It was so hot, and His voice broke as he gestured helplessly toward the doors the nurse had disappeared through. Margaret nodded, her expression one of both concern and reassurance. "You did the right thing," she said. "You got the baby here, and that's what matters most. But is it going to be okay?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's face softened, but she didn't give him the answer he so desperately wanted. "We're doing everything we can. The baby's in good hands now." Ethan's legs finally gave out, and he sank into one of the plastic chairs lining the wall. The adrenaline that had propelled him this far drained away, leaving him exhausted and lightheaded. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. As he sat there, fragments of the past few minutes replayed in his mind. The baby's cries, the oppressive heat inside the car, the feeling of the child's fragile body in his arms. For the first time since it had all started, he let himself feel the full weight of the fear that had gripped him. The sound of hurried footsteps broke through his thoughts. He looked up to see the nurse from earlier returning, her face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from working under pressure. She walked straight toward him, and Ethan's heart climbed into his throat. "The baby is stable," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "It was close, but you got it here in time. That made all the difference." Ethan exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a dozen new questions. "Will the baby be okay now? Do you know who it belongs to?" The nurse held up a hand to stop him gently. "The baby's still weak and needs monitoring, but for now, the immediate danger has passed. The police have been called to investigate. They'll want to talk to you." "The police?" Ethan blinked. He hadn't even thought about that. The urgency of the moment had left no room for anything else. "Yes," the nurse said. "We'll need to find out how this happened and where the baby's parents are." Ethan nodded numbly, the enormity of the situation settling over him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling as a flood of emotions coursed through him. Relief, worry, and a lingering sense of helplessness. Somewhere behind those double doors, the baby he had saved was fighting to recover. And for Ethan, the weight of that life in his hands was something he knew he would carry with him forever. The sterile smell of antiseptic hung in the air as Ethan sat in the clinic's waiting room, still reeling from the nurse's words. The police were coming, and his mind raced with what he might need to explain. He replayed every moment since finding the baby in the car. The cries, the unbearable heat, the shattering glass. He stared at his hands again, as if he could still feel the fragile weight of the baby. The double doors leading to the emergency wing swung open, and a woman in a white coat stepped through. Her sharp yet warm eyes immediately landed on Ethan. She was tall, with her gray-streaked hair tied back in a neat bun. Her name tag read Dr. Margaret Reeves. "Are you the young man who brought the baby in?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded quickly, standing so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the tile. "Yes, ma'am. Is the baby okay?" Margaret approached him with measured steps, exuding an aura of quiet authority. "You did well. The baby's temperature was dangerously high, and dehydration had set in. Another 10 minutes, and we might have lost them." Her expression softened as she added, "But you acted quickly. You saved that child's life." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. The relief was overwhelming, but her words also left him feeling exposed. He had simply done what he thought anyone would do, yet hearing it framed as heroism made his chest tighten. I didn't know what else to do," he stammered. "I just couldn't leave them there." Margaret's eyes flicked to the faint scratches on his hands, likely from the broken glass. "It takes courage to act in moments like that. Most people would have hesitated. Tell me, how are you holding up?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. How was he holding up? He wasn't sure. The surge of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a swirling mix of emotions he couldn't untangle. Margaret gestured toward the small break room just off the waiting area. "Come on, let's sit for a moment. You look like you could use some water." Without waiting for a reply, she led the way, and Ethan followed. Inside, the room was quiet and modest. A small table, a few chairs, and a coffee machine humming softly on the counter. Margaret handed him a bottle of water and took a seat across from him. As Ethan drank, she spoke. "The police will want to talk to you soon. Don't worry, they'll just need to know what happened. You'll be helping them piece together the story." Ethan nodded, though the idea of talking to the police made his stomach twist. I don't get it," he said finally. "How could anyone leave a baby like that? It doesn't make sense." Margaret's expression turned grave. "Unfortunately, it happens more often than you'd think. Sometimes it's a mistake, other times it's negligence." Her voice trailed off, her tone heavy with unspoken stories. Ethan's jaw tightened. He couldn't imagine forgetting about a child. The image of the baby, red-faced and gasping for air, was burned into his mind. Margaret seemed to sense his turmoil. "You did everything you could," she said gently. "And because of you, that baby has a chance." Before Ethan could respond, there was a knock at the door. A uniformed police officer stood in the doorway, his notepad already in hand. He had a calm, professional demeanor but carried an air of authority that made Ethan's pulse quicken. "Is this the young man?" the officer asked, glancing at Margaret. She nodded. Ethan was the one who brought the baby in. The officer stepped into the room, his gaze settling on Ethan. "I'm Officer Grayson. I just need to ask you a few questions about what happened." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat but nodded. "Okay." Grayson pulled out a chair and sat down, flipping open his notepad. "Start from the beginning. Where were you, and how did you find the baby?" Ethan recounted the events as clearly as he could. The faint cries, the locked car, the unbearable heat. His voice wavered slightly when he described smashing the window and carrying the baby to the clinic. Grayson listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "You said there was no one else in the parking lot?" the officer asked. Ethan shook his head. "No. I looked around, called out, but no one came." Grayson nodded, closing his notepad. "Thank you, Ethan. That was brave of you. We'll do our best to find out who the child belongs to and what happened." The officer stood and turned to Margaret. "I'll need to see the child's medical report once things settle down." Margaret nodded. Of course. As Grayson left the room, Ethan slumped back in his chair, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Margaret placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "That's the hardest part over. Now you need to breathe. You've done more than enough today." Ethan looked at her, his mind still buzzing with questions. "Will the baby really be okay?" Margaret smiled softly. "With the care they're getting now? Yes, they'll recover. Thanks to you." Her words brought a flicker of relief, but Ethan knew this day would stay with him forever. Every detail, the baby's cries, the heat, the moment he broke the window, was etched into his memory. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the quiet. Margaret stood, her expression shifting to one of resolve. "Ethan, stay here and rest for a bit. There's more to come. But for now, let yourself breathe." Ethan nodded, though he doubted he could relax. The image of the baby's desperate eyes lingered, a reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. Ethan sat in the small break room, the bottle of water untouched in his hand. Despite Margaret's reassurances, his mind churned with unease. His thoughts kept returning to the baby, its flushed face, shallow breaths, and the terrifying stillness as he had run through the streets. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Time seemed to move sluggishly, every second stretching into an eternity. The murmur of voices from the hallway occasionally broke the silence, reminding him that, just beyond those doors, the world was still spinning. The break room door opened, and Margaret stepped inside. She had traded her calm demeanor for something sterner, her expression shadowed by concern. Behind her, a pair of uniformed officers followed. Officer Grayson and a second, younger officer with a notepad tucked under his arm. "Ethan," Margaret said, her voice steady, "the officers have a few more questions. This won't take long." Ethan straightened in his seat, his hands tightening around the water bottle. "Okay," he said, though his voice was barely audible. Grayson stepped forward, pulling a chair closer to Ethan. His partner remained standing by the door, watching intently. "Ethan, I know you've already told me what happened," Grayson began, his tone calm but probing. "But I want to revisit the details. Sometimes the smallest things can make a difference. Let's start from the beginning." Ethan took a deep breath and recounted the story again, slower this time. He described the empty parking lot, the muffled cries, the unbearable heat radiating off the car. His voice faltered as he described the baby's weak movements, the sound of the rock breaking the window, and the suffocating heat that had enveloped them both. "Did you see anything unusual in the car?" Grayson asked. "A bag? A wallet? A phone? Anything that might help us identify who left the baby there?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I didn't look for anything. I just focused on getting the baby out." Grayson nodded, his pen hovering over the notepad. "And you didn't see anyone nearby? No one watching or walking away from the car?" "No one," Ethan said firmly. The parking lot was empty. The younger officer jotted something down on his notepad before Grayson leaned back in his chair. His face softened slightly. "Ethan, you did a brave thing today. Smashing that window could have been risky, but you likely saved a life. That's not something we see every day." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. The weight of their praise felt strange, almost unwelcome. I couldn't leave them there," he muttered. Margaret, who had been standing silently near the counter, stepped forward. "Officers," she interjected gently, "I think that's enough for now. Ethan has been through a lot." Grayson nodded, rising to his feet. "Of course. Thank you, Ethan. We'll let you know if we need anything else." As the officers left, Margaret sat across from Ethan, her expression softer now. "You're handling this better than most adults would," she said. "But it's okay if you're feeling overwhelmed. What you did today, it's a lot to process." Ethan looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly. "What happens now?" he asked. "To the baby, I mean." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "The child will stay here until we're sure they've recovered. After that, it'll depend on what the police find. If they locate the parents, they'll have questions to answer. If not," she hesitated. "Well, social services might get involved." "Social services?" Ethan echoed, the words unfamiliar and heavy. Margaret nodded. "If the parents can't be found, or if they're deemed unfit, the baby might be placed in foster care. It's not an easy path, but the system is there to make sure children are safe." Ethan's stomach churned at the thought. The idea of the baby, so small and vulnerable, being handed off to strangers made his chest tighten. "Do you think the parents forgot?" he asked, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. Margaret sighed. "It's possible. People make mistakes, even terrible ones. But it's also possible this wasn't an accident. That's what the investigation will determine." Ethan leaned back in his chair, the enormity of it all pressing down on him. He had acted on instinct, But now the weight of what he had stumbled into felt almost unbearable. As if sensing his turmoil, Margaret reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "You did the right thing, Ethan. Remember that." Before he could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Reeves," she said, her voice brisk. "The baby's condition has stabilized further. Vitals are improving." Margaret's shoulders relaxed visibly. "Thank you," she said, rising from her chair. Ethan watched her go, a flicker of relief warming the cold knot of fear in his chest. The baby was safe for now, but the unanswered questions loomed like storm clouds. As he sat alone in the quiet break room, Ethan felt the weight of the day settle deeper. This wasn't just a moment of heroism. It was the start of something far more complicated, something that would stay with him long after he left the clinic. Hours passed before the police returned to the clinic, their presence stirring whispers among the staff and visitors. Ethan had stayed in the break room, his nerves too frayed to leave. He sat with his head in his hands, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. When the door finally opened, it wasn't an officer who entered. It was Dr. Margaret, her expression unreadable. "The baby's parents have been found," she said, her tone steady but tinged with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Ethan sat up abruptly. "Are they here? What did they say?" Margaret took a seat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "The father arrived at the clinic after the police tracked him down through the car's registration. He was distraught, Ethan. He says he thought the mother had taken the baby out of the car when they arrived at the supermarket." Ethan's stomach churned. "He forgot? How do you forget your own baby?" Margaret sighed deeply. People underestimate how distractions, stress, and routines can lead to catastrophic mistakes. The police are speaking with both parents now, and they'll determine if this was negligence or something more serious. Before Ethan could respond, the door opened again, and Officer Grayson stepped inside. His expression was firm but not unkind. "Ethan, the parents would like to speak with you. If you're up for it, I can arrange it." Ethan hesitated, the thought of facing the people who had put the baby in danger filling him with both anger and unease. But after a moment, he nodded. "Okay." Grayson led Ethan down the hall to a small consultation room. Inside, a man sat hunched over, his face buried in his hands, while a woman stood by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The tension in the room was suffocating. The man looked up as Ethan entered. His eyes were red and swollen, his face etched with guilt. "You're the boy who saved my child," he said, his voice breaking. Ethan froze, unsure of what to say. The woman turned from the window, her tear-streaked face pale. "Thank you," she whispered. I can't even begin to." Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. The man stood, his movements unsteady. "You gave us a second chance. If you hadn't been there," he trailed off, his words faltering under the weight of his emotions. Ethan's anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface, flared. "How could you leave a baby in a car?" he blurted out, his voice sharper than he intended. "Do you even understand how close it was? Your kid almost..." He stopped himself, the words too painful to finish. The man flinched, his guilt plain on his face. "I thought my wife had taken him," he said weakly. "I swear, I thought..." "You thought wrong," Ethan snapped, his voice trembling. Margaret, who had followed them into the room, stepped forward. "Ethan," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I understand your anger, but this family will live with the consequences of this day for the rest of their lives. They've made a terrible mistake, and it's not our place to punish them." The room fell into an uneasy silence. The man sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumped in defeat, while the woman continued to sob softly. Ethan looked at them, his emotions a tangled knot of frustration, pity, and lingering fear for the baby. Margaret turned to the parents. "Your child is stable now," she said softly, "but this incident will have legal and emotional repercussions. The police and social services will be in touch to ensure the safety of your family moving forward." The parents nodded numbly, their gratitude and remorse heavy in the air. As Grayson ushered Ethan out of the room, the man's voice called after him. "Thank you," he said again, his voice breaking. "You'll never know how much it means to us." Ethan didn't reply. He followed Grayson back into the hallway, his steps slow and heavy. The adrenaline that had carried him through the day was long gone, leaving behind only exhaustion and a lingering ache in his chest. Margaret caught up with him as he neared the clinic's entrance. "Ethan," she said, her voice warm and steady, "I know this has been overwhelming, but I want you to understand something. What you did today, the courage, the compassion, it matters, not just for that baby, but for everyone who saw it. You've shown us what it means to act selflessly." Ethan looked down at his shoes, unsure how to respond. Her words felt heavy, almost too much to bear. But deep down, he knew they were true. As he stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, Ethan took a deep breath. The air was still warm, but it carried a coolness that hinted at evening. He stared at the horizon, the events of the day playing over and over in his mind. For the first time, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. The baby was safe. The parents had a chance to make things right. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan had found something in himself he hadn't known was there. The days that followed blurred together for Ethan. Life in Brookfield returned to its usual slow rhythm, but for him, nothing felt the same. He returned to school, though his thoughts frequently wandered back to the baby he had saved and the haunting image of its flushed, fragile face. News of Ethan's actions had spread quickly through the small town. His classmates whispered about him in the halls, and neighbors stopped him on the street to offer their congratulations. It was overwhelming, and Ethan found himself avoiding the attention whenever he could. "I didn't do anything special," he would mutter when someone praised him. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. One afternoon, as he sat in the back row of his history class, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Dr. Margaret Reeves. "Ethan, I've been thinking about what happened and how you handled it. Would you like to visit the clinic again? I think you might find it worthwhile." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, unsure how to respond. He remembered the warmth in Margaret's eyes when she spoke to him, the calm confidence in her voice. There was something reassuring about her presence, something that made him feel grounded in the chaos of that day. He typed back a quick reply, "Sure." When the clinic was quieter than it had been the last time Ethan had visited. Margaret greeted him at the entrance, her white coat crisp and her smile welcoming. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading him through the familiar hallways. "I thought it might help to show you a different side of this place. A side you don't often see unless you're part of it." Margaret led him to a storage room filled with supplies, bandages, gloves, syringes, and neatly labeled boxes of medication. "This is where it all starts," she said, handing Ethan a pair of gloves. "Today, I thought you might help us restock some of the rooms." Ethan hesitated. "I don't know anything about this stuff." "You don't need to," Margaret said with a gentle laugh. "It's just about lending a hand and getting a sense of what goes on behind the scenes." As they worked, Margaret talked about the clinic and the people who came through its doors. She described the long hours, the difficult cases, and the small victories that made it all worthwhile. Ethan listened intently, feeling an unfamiliar sense of awe at her dedication. "What you did for that baby," Margaret said as she stacked a box of gloves, "reminded me why I chose this career in the first place. It's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture when you're buried in paperwork and protocols. But every life we touch, it matters." Ethan didn't know what to say. He thought back to the day at the parking lot, to the fear and urgency that had driven him to act. He hadn't felt brave or heroic. He had just felt desperate to help. When they finished restocking, Margaret led him to one of the clinic's pediatric rooms. A young boy sat on the examination table, swinging his legs nervously. His mother stood nearby, her expression anxious. "This is James," Margaret said, introducing Ethan with a smile. "He's here for a checkup, but he's a little nervous." "Ethan, would you like to keep him company while I get the charts?" Caught off guard, Ethan nodded. Sure." James looked at Ethan with wide eyes. "Are you a doctor?" Ethan chuckled nervously. "Not even close. I'm just here to help out." The boy grinned. "Doctors are scary, but you're not scary." As they talked, Ethan felt a surprising warmth bloom in his chest. He made faces to make James laugh, asked about his favorite video games, and listened as the boy rattled off a story about his dog. By the time Margaret returned, James seemed completely at ease. "You have a way with kids," Margaret remarked after James and his mother had left. Ethan shrugged, though her words lingered in his mind. He hadn't thought of himself as good with kids before, but as he reflected on his brief interaction with James, he realized how much he had enjoyed it. As they walked back toward the main lobby, Margaret stopped and turned to Ethan. "Have you ever thought about what you want to do in the future?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I haven't really thought about it much." Margaret smiled. "That's normal. But after what I've seen from you, your quick thinking, your compassion, I think you have the makings of someone who could make a difference. Maybe not as a doctor, but in your own way." Her words stayed with Ethan as he left the clinic that day. For the first time, he wondered if his future might hold something more than the quiet life he had always envisioned in Brookfield. The idea stirred something deep inside him, a spark of possibility he couldn't ignore. Ethan's visit to the clinic lingered in his mind for days. Margaret's words about making a difference played on repeat, stirring a quiet but persistent question within him. What could I do with my life that really mattered? The following weekend, Margaret invited Ethan back to the clinic, not just as a visitor, but as a helper. She greeted him at the entrance with the same calm warmth, handing him a clipboard and a pair of gloves. "Today, I thought you could help organize some supplies and assist with a few simple tasks," she said. "No pressure, just an inside look at what we do here every day." Ethan followed her through the bright hallways, now feeling more familiar. Nurses bustled past, patients moved between rooms, and the hum of conversation and activity filled the air. There was a sense of purpose here that Ethan couldn't ignore, and it drew him in. Margaret led him to a storage room where shelves were packed with medical supplies. "Let's start here," she said, showing him how to inventory the items. They worked side by side, the quiet task leaving room for conversation. "Have you thought more about what you'd like to do after school?" Margaret asked, her tone casual but curious. Ethan hesitated, his hands hovering over a box of syringes. "Not really," he admitted. "I mean, I guess I've been thinking about it more since, Margaret smiled. "Since the day you saved that baby?" Ethan nodded, feeling a twinge of embarrassment. "Yeah, I guess it made me realize that maybe I want to do something important. Something that actually helps people." Margaret's expression softened. "That's a powerful realization, Ethan. Not everyone comes to it so early in life." As the day went on, Ethan followed Margaret through the clinic, assisting where he could. He handed out water bottles in the waiting room, watched nurses take vital signs, and even sat in on a routine checkup. Margaret encouraged him to ask questions, and he found himself fascinated by the small but crucial details of medical care. At one point, Margaret handed him a clipboard and said, "Come with me. There's a patient I'd like you to meet." Ethan followed her into a room where a little girl sat on the edge of an examination table, her legs swinging back and forth. She looked up with wide, curious eyes as they entered. "This is Mia," Margaret said, introducing the girl. "She's here for a follow-up after a minor surgery." "Ethan, why don't you sit with her while I review her chart?" Ethan hesitated, then took a seat next to Mia. She looked at him with a shy smile. "Are you a doctor?" "Not even close," Ethan said with a laugh. "I'm just here to help out." Mia giggled. "You don't look like a doctor. You look like someone who plays soccer." Ethan grinned. "Well, I do play a little soccer. What about you? Do you like soccer?" As they talked, Ethan noticed how Mia's nervousness seemed to melt away. By the time Margaret returned, the little girl was laughing, her earlier tension completely gone. "You have a gift, Ethan," Margaret said later, as they walked down the hallway. "Connecting with people like that, it's not something you can teach." Ethan didn't know how to respond, but her words planted a seed of hope in him. For the first time, he wondered if there was a place for him in a field like this, somewhere he could use that connection to make a real difference. Before he left the clinic that day, Margaret stopped him near the front desk. "Ethan, have you ever thought about volunteering? We could use someone like you here." even if it's just a few hours during school breaks. The idea took him by surprise. Volunteering? You mean like helping out around the clinic? Margaret nodded. Exactly. You'd get to see more of what we do, and it might help you figure out if this is something you're truly passionate about. Ethan thought about it on the walk home, his mind buzzing with possibilities. Volunteering at the clinic wasn't something he'd ever imagined for himself, but the more he thought about it, the more it felt right. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table staring at his history homework, Ethan realized something had shifted in him. The idea of his future no longer felt vague or uncertain. For the first time, he could see a path forward, one that might lead him to a life where he could truly make a difference. Ethan's first day as a volunteer at the clinic came faster than he expected. With Margaret's encouragement, he had signed up to help during weekends and school breaks, eager to learn more about the world she had introduced him to. As he walked into the familiar building, wearing a name tag with volunteer printed underneath his name, he felt a nervous flutter in his chest. Margaret greeted him at the entrance, her smile warm and reassuring. "Welcome back, Ethan. Let's get started." The day was a whirlwind. Ethan helped file paperwork, observed a nurse demonstrating how to prepare equipment for sterilization, and assisted with minor organizational tasks. While the work was mundane at times, it was the environment that drew him in, the constant hum of purpose, the shared goal of helping others. Late in the afternoon, Margaret appeared in the hallway and beckoned him over. "There's someone here who would like to see you," she said with a knowing smile. Ethan followed her into a small private room, and there they were, the parents of the baby he had saved weeks ago. They sat together, the father holding the now healthy infant in his arms, while the mother stood, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Ethan," the father began, his voice thick with gratitude, "I don't even know where to start. You saved our child's life. Because of you, we still have a family." The mother stepped forward, holding a small box wrapped in blue paper. "This is for you," she said softly. "It's not much, but we wanted you to have something to remember. To remember how much you've done for us." Ethan hesitated before accepting the box, his cheeks flushing. "You don't have to thank me," he said awkwardly. "I just did what anyone would have done." The mother's eyes filled with tears. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "Not everyone would have done what you did. You didn't hesitate. You acted when it mattered most." Ethan opened the box slowly. Inside was a small framed photo of the baby, now smiling and lively. The frame was engraved with a simple message: "You gave us hope. Thank you." For a moment, Ethan couldn't find the words to respond. He looked at the picture, then at the parents, and finally at the baby, who gurgled happily in her father's arms. "I'm just glad she's okay," he said at last, his voice trembling. After the parents left, Ethan sat with Margaret in one of the quieter hallways, the frame still in his hands. "I didn't expect that," he admitted, staring down at the smiling baby in the photo. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "It's moments like these that remind us why we do this work," she said. "It's not always easy, and it's not always rewarding in the way people expect. But when you see the impact you've had on someone's life, it changes everything." Ethan nodded slowly. He thought about the baby's bright eyes, so full of life now compared to that day in the parking lot. The memory still haunted him, but now it felt lighter, softened by the knowledge that his actions had made a difference. As the sun began to set, Ethan helped Margaret close up for the day. On the walk home, he carried the framed photo carefully in his bag, his thoughts drifting between the past and the future. In the days that followed, Ethan continued volunteering at the clinic. He found himself looking forward to each shift, eager to learn more, to do more. Every task, no matter how small, felt like a step toward something greater. The more time he spent there, the more his dreams began to take shape. The idea of becoming a doctor, once a faint spark, was now a clear and steady flame. Ethan began to imagine himself in Margaret's shoes, making decisions, saving lives, offering comfort to those who needed it most. But it wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about the connections, the moments of humanity that Margaret had shown him time and again. And for the first time, Ethan saw a future where he could truly belong. The months that followed were a whirlwind for Ethan. Between school, volunteering, and the growing support from Margaret, his days felt fuller than ever before. The clinic had become his second home, and he found himself immersed in the rhythms of its daily operations. At school, his focus sharpened. Classes that once felt tedious now carried a new sense of importance. Science, biology in particular, fascinated him in ways it never had before. Ethan began staying after class to ask his teacher questions, poring over textbooks at night. For the first time, he felt driven not by grades, but by the possibility of something greater, a future he could work toward. Margaret, always attuned to his growth, noticed his increasing curiosity. During one of his shifts, as they sorted through patient files, she said, "You've been different lately, Ethan. More focused." He paused, considering her words. I think I know what I want to do now," he admitted. "I want to help people. Maybe even become a doctor like you." Margaret's smile was proud but measured. "That's a wonderful goal," she said, "but you'll need to work for it. Medical school isn't easy, and neither is the life that comes after. It's a commitment, one that changes everything." "I know," Ethan said, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "But after everything that's happened, I can't imagine doing anything else." Margaret nodded, her voice softening. "Then you have my support, every step of the way." As Ethan's commitment deepened, so did his reputation in Brookfield. His story had become the kind of tale that small towns loved. A local boy who had saved a life and found his calling in the process. One afternoon, while Ethan was restocking supplies at the clinic, a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see the baby's parents standing in the doorway, the mother holding their child, now healthy and glowing with life. "We wanted to check in," the father said, his tone warm. "And to thank you again." Ethan smiled shyly, still unused to their gratitude. "I'm glad she's doing well. She's thriving," the mother said, adjusting the baby in her arms. "And it's because of you. I hope you know that." They chatted for a few minutes, their words brimming with kindness and appreciation. When they left, Margaret appeared at Ethan's side, watching them go. "They'll never forget what you did for them," she said. Ethan shook his head. "I think I'll never forget what they did for me." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "They gave me a reason," he said simply, "to figure out who I want to be." Ethan's resolve began to ripple outward. His school counselor, hearing of his aspirations, connected him with a local pre-med mentorship program. Margaret, ever the mentor herself, invited him to shadow her during her rounds. Each experience deepened his understanding of what it meant to care for others, both the rewards and the sacrifices. But as his dream became clearer, so did the obstacles. Medical school loomed as a distant, daunting mountain, one that would require years of hard work, money, and resilience. Late one evening, as Ethan flipped through a college guidebook, the weight of it all pressed heavily on him. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "It's a commitment, one that changes everything." For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Could he really do this? Did he have what it took? But then he thought of the baby, of the parents who had looked at him with such gratitude, of the countless small moments in the clinic where he had felt part of something greater. Ethan closed the book, his mind made up. He might not have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing. This was the path he was meant to take, and he would do whatever it took to walk it. Years passed, each one bringing Ethan closer to the dream he had forged in the small clinic in Brookfield. The road was far from easy. Late nights spent studying, grueling exams, and financial worries tested his resolve. But Ethan never wavered. The memory of the baby he had saved, and the spark it had ignited, kept him moving forward. Margaret remained a steadfast presence in his life. Though she retired from the clinic before Ethan graduated high school, their bond endured. She became a mentor in the truest sense, offering advice, encouragement, and the occasional firm reminder to take care of himself. When Ethan finally earned his acceptance into medical school, Margaret was the first person he called. Her voice over the phone trembled with pride as she said, "I always knew you'd do it, Ethan. The world needs doctors like you." Years later, on the day of Ethan's graduation from medical school, Margaret sat in the audience, her eyes shining with tears. The auditorium was filled with applause as Ethan, now a young man with a quiet confidence, walked across the stage to receive his diploma. After the ceremony, Margaret met him outside, where clusters of graduates and their families gathered to celebrate. She embraced him warmly. "You've come a long way from that day in the parking lot," she said with a smile. Ethan laughed, the memory bittersweet. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "And yet," Margaret said, "it's only the beginning." Ethan returned to Brookfield after completing his residency, his heart set on giving back to the community that had shaped him. With Margaret's guidance, he opened a small clinic in the heart of town. The modest building quickly became a hub for accessible, compassionate care, a place where everyone, regardless of their means, could find help. The clinic was a reflection of everything Ethan had learned from Margaret and his own journey. He treated every patient with the same empathy and urgency he had felt that day when he saved the baby. One sunny afternoon, Ethan stood in his clinic's waiting room, flipping through patient charts. The door opened, and a young woman stepped inside, carrying a toddler on her hip. Ethan looked up and froze. It was the baby he had saved years ago, now a healthy, giggling child with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. The mother smiled warmly at Ethan. "I thought it was time for you to meet her properly," she said. Ethan crouched down to the child's level, his voice soft. "Hey there, do you remember me?" The toddler tilted her head curiously, then reached out with tiny hands to touch his face. Ethan's heart swelled as he laughed. "Guess not," he said, glancing up at her mother. "She knows your name," the mother said. "We've told her the story so many times. You're a part of her life, Ethan." Whether she remembers that day or not, as they talked, Ethan felt the full circle of his journey. That baby had been the catalyst for everything, the moment that turned his life upside down and gave him purpose. One evening, as the clinic settled into its quiet nighttime hum, Ethan stood outside, watching the sunset cast Brookfield in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret stepped out to join him, her hair now silver and her steps slower, but her presence just as steady. "You did it," she said simply. Ethan smiled, the weight of her words sinking in. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, Ethan, you had it in you all along. I just helped you see it." They stood together in silence, watching the day fade into night. For Ethan, it wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun with a single act of courage. Under the same sky where it all started, Ethan felt the promise of what lay ahead. This was his purpose, his life's work, and he was ready to embrace it.